Before the city's notions of modernization took hold, Southwest Washington, D.C. was a vibrant community with a rich culture. The neighborhood housed generations of families, thriving businesses, and a sense of pride that was rooted in the primarily African American makeup. It was a place where the community came together and celebrated history. From the small corner stores to the iconic St. Dominic's Church, the people of Southwest D.C. had built a strong foundation, evident by its close-knit streets dotted with unique buildings. However, city planners saw an opportunity for profits and saw Southwest as a blighted area in need of renewal. In 1950, the National Capital Park and Planning Commission, NCPPC, declared Southwest to be a problem area despite its cultural significance. The district was deemed an eyesore, citing its overcrowded conditions and relative poverty. However, these conditions were not nearly as dire as they seemed, and despite them, the community thrived. Yet, the decision was still made to tear it down and rebuild it from the ground up. By the 1950s, the threat of demolition and rebuilding loomed on the horizon. The Redevelopment Act of 1945, which established the D.C. Redevelopment Land Agency, had given the city the authority to seize entire sections of city while citing eminent domain. As early as 1952, planners began to develop a vision for a new Southwest. This new plan prioritized modernist architecture and tailoring to lobbyist groups, such as highway unions, rather than honoring the rich cultural heritage that already existed. The urban renewal taking place in Southwest D.C. wasn't just a reflection of ideals in this area. Across the country, similar initiatives were taking place. The disconnect between development and preservation of resident culture was a defining theme of almost all of them. However, the urban renewal in D.C. is particularly unique due to the situation of the civil rights movement in the capital at the same time. The juxtaposition of these two opposing ways of thinking sheds light on the roots of both topics. In 1954, with the approval of the Southwest Redevelopment Plan, demolition began. The community was decimated. Homes, businesses, schools, and churches were all razed in the name of progress. Over 23,000 people were displaced from their homes, with no reasonable path of recourse or new housing. The construction of the Southwest Freeway, cutting directly through the heart of the district, would be one of the most visible symbols of this transformation. It physically separated Southwest from the rest of the city, but also served as a cultural and emotional barrier. St. Dominic's Church, once an African American and Jewish community hub, became one of the most prominent victims of the renewal efforts. It was now surrounded by freeways and federal buildings instead of small businesses and homes. The church was a symbol of the community's vitality, but it was soon overshadowed by the city's ambitions for new infrastructure. And by the late 1950s, plans had fully taken hold. The era of demolition was in full swing. What had been a thriving community of businesses and homes, predominantly inhabited by African Americans, would be wiped off the map. The government's sweeping approach disregarded the area's deep-rooted history and culture. From 1955 onward, demolition swept through Southwest, displaced families from homes they had lived in for generations and reducing them to rubble. The families struggled to find similarly priced homes that they could afford in other areas. The construction of the Southwest Freeway deepened the divide between Southwest and the rest of D.C. This freeway, which physically separated the neighborhood from the rest of the city, also became a metaphor for the displacement and isolation that Black and other oppressed communities faced during this period of urban renewal.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
As the Southwest Redevelopment Plan took hold and made impact, a newly structured city wasn't the only thing emerging. The mid-1950s to the late 1960s marked a period of intense civil rights activism in Washington, D.C., a city that was home to many of the country's most influential civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and the Urban League, as well as protests by famous activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. The stark contrast between the city's modernization and the fast-growing civil rights movement is impossible to ignore. While the government and policymakers focused on modernist architecture in the nation's capital, Black activists pushed for positive change in their rights. However, the actions taken during the urban renewal movement often did quite the opposite in effect. Key events in the civil rights movement took place during this period, from the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. However, despite the national push for civil rights in Washington, D.C., urban renewal was not lifting Americans out of poverty. Rather, it was displacing them. As planners looked ahead, they saw opportunities to build new housing developments that were symbolic of the era's modernist aspirations. Buildings designed for the middle class rather than the working class African American families who had previously lived there. The architects chosen for this project, I.M. Pei and Cloethea Woodard Smith, envisioned a new Southwest as a sleek and modernist neighborhood. This was to replace the old, organic design with a rigid and impersonal layout. The community's sense of identity and connection to the space was dismissed in favor of a top-down vision of progress. By 1959, their first major residential development, Capitol Park Apartments, was completed. It was marketed as a solution to the problems caused by the previous neighborhood. Yet, this development catered to middle-class, racially integrated residents, completely disregarding the displaced low-income African American community that had once called Southwest home. Similarly, in 1960, River Park Mutual Homes opened, offering modernist cooperative dwellings that again were tailored to middle-income professionals, rather than the displaced families who had been the lifeblood of Southwest. Finally, in 1962, Tiber Island, one of the most recognized projects of urban renewal in Southwest and even nationwide, was completed. This could be considered the nail in the coffin. It represented a shift from residential areas to a mix of townhomes and high-rise buildings that catered to an entirely different demographic, leaving the original residents out of the picture. Perhaps nowhere in the country was the tension between the civil rights struggle and urban renewal more evident than in Southwest D.C. The redevelopment project physically tore apart an already marginalized community, most of whom were African American. At the same time, the civil rights movement was gaining national momentum, headquartered in Washington, D.C., culminating in key legal victories like the Brown v. Board of Education ruling in 1954, which mandated the desegregation of public schools. Ironically, as successful as these programs were nationwide, they couldn't tackle the problem right there in D.C. of urban renewal. Despite the numerous timely victories for the civil rights movement, urban renewal projects like those in Southwest highlighted the slow pace of progress for African Americans. The new developments that replaced their homes were not intended for them. They were designed for the middle and upper classes and largely catered to white professionals. The HUD report of 1970 from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development praised the architectural design of the renewal, but it admitted that the project had failed the community it was supposed to help. Marking the tail end of this era of redevelopment in Southwest D.C., the new developments of Town Center East and West were completed. They were marketed as symbols of progress, but however, they stood in contrast to the community's original spirit, a community fractured by policies of displacement and gentrification. The story of urban renewal in Southwest D.C. is a reminder of the consequences of development, without consideration for those who will affect most. The debate of gentrification remains relevant to this day, and looking back at a case study such as this one can help us to make better decisions for the cultures that we still have. The situation of the development in D.C. occurring at the same time as the civil rights movement in the same area is telling, as it further emphasizes the government's past apathy for oppressed groups. It also acts as a reminder that we must never allow this degree of disregard to occur again. Despite the intensive protests occurring, the damage continued to occur to the community's fabric. Southwest D.C.'s history is a lesson in the need for inclusive urban planning, ensuring that every community has a say in the matter.